Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today I'm excited to say we are talking about a brand new James Bond adventure, 007 First Light, the new video game from IO Interactive, created in partnership with Eon Productions and now Amazon MGM to tell the origin story of a new version of James Bond. I've been looking forward to this video game for a long time, and it seems to have really taken the community by storm. There's a lot of active discussion at the moment, and the numbers don't lie. Over on Instagram, I'm seeing my posts related to First Light really take off. There's some interest in what First Light is doing, especially now that we have an exciting new trailer to react to. I'm really excited for that conversation to continue, especially as we get closer to the game's release and then the experience we all have when we get to play it. But I wanted to take a moment to apply the Analyze This Mr. Bond approach to the trailer. First off, to analyze what it means for the Bond property on the whole, and then talk about what we can see and understand about its approach to the Bond character. So let's start with the macro perspective. The video game industry is currently 3 times more valuable than the film industry. It is a juggernaut. It is a cultural force to be reckoned with, especially with younger generations. There's an argument to be made that video games are more significant right now than cinema. I had always suspected that this video game, which was originally being developed under the title Project 007, was going to be a way to reestablish the character for younger generations after Daniel Craig's era ended in No Time to Die. With the way No Time to Die left things, it seemed like an organic move to essentially soft launch Bond with a younger generation before you come out guns blazing with another film. And 007 First Light now seems like it's taken that mandate seriously. The trailer we've seen for 007 First Light is essentially what we would expect from a trailer for Bond 26. It immediately reestablishes the Bond character. It uses the language of modern blockbusters and blockbuster cinema. It feels like a full reestablishment of the Bond brand. In fact, there are even major tie-ins and product placements from some of the most significant Bond brands. Omega, Aston Martin, even the clothing brand worn by Daniel Craig as James Bond, Orla Bar Brown, is participating in this. It feels like a very proper extension of the Eon Productions Bond era. And that makes sense. It was created in collaboration with Eon Productions. And you really feel that DNA in the trailer. You see a lot of tropes pulled over from the Daniel Craig era, even though the tone is shifting towards something lighter, a little bouncier. People have compared the trailers feeling a little bit more to the Mission Impossible films, and I think that's fair, especially in the way that this version of James Bond has a slightly more, let's say, Ethan Hunt style of wardrobe. We're really seeing First Light be our first major relaunch of the character after the character met his demise in No Time to Die. And the excitement and energy around this video game, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that the audience is salivating for that new take on James Bond. If this video game trailer had dropped in the middle of the Craig era, I don't think you would have seen this immediately feverish response to it. And it's a very exciting, well-made trailer for what looks to be a very fun video game. And it's also, interestingly, going back to the origins of James Bond. That's an interesting strategic move because it not only reestablishes the character, but it allows the video game to kind of nod back to one of the most successful installments in recent memory, Casino Royale. In fact, there's even footage in the trailer that seems to call right back to that film's Madagascar chase, with Bond wearing a similar outfit at a similar sort of construction site with red girders and all that, and incorporate that into a new narrative that sort of reestablishes the character so that the films don't have to give us another origin story for the character. If the video games go ahead and get that out of the way, Bond 26 can just kind of leap into the action, assuming the younger audience is already caught up on who this character is and what drives this character. It's a smart strategic move. It's great for IO Interactive because giving players the ability to play Bond's origin story and grow with this character as he develops into Bond mirrors the player's journey as the player develops skills over the course of the game. So it gives a nice arc for both this game and the planned sequels. It also benefits the long-term game plan for the film series because Bond 26 can kind of launch on the assumption that the character has already been reestablished in the younger generation's mind and just pick up from that general context. This is essentially a palate cleanser. And I want to give the video game credit. This feels like a major Bond event in terms of creating a real palate cleanser between cinematic Bond eras. 007 First Light seems to be doing a pretty good job of that. So let's analyze this version of the character, his world, and what's going on. In many ways, this feels like a very clear extension of the Daniel Craig universe. His relationship with who seems to be Moneypenny feels very much pulled right out of the fabric of the Craig movies. We have fashion cues pulled from the Craig movies, especially the more casual looks in Casino Royale. The tactical fighting style of Daniel Craig's Bond movies has been established in the sort of third-person shooter framework of this game. But we've also pivoted away from the morose, tortured nature of the Daniel Craig Bond character to something lighter. There's a lot more brevity and colorful campiness in this version of Bond. In this story, this young, unformed version of Bond is apparently proving himself to earn his 00 number, and he's hunting down a villainous 009, and there's an interesting soldier with almost like a Roman-style gold mask that suggests a leap into more traditional Bond fantasy than we ever saw during the Daniel Craig era. So it's kind of blending together this legacy of cinematic Bond with some of the more immediately recognizable textures of the Daniel Craig era. So it feels like an organic evolution of what we might call the Eon Productions project. That is to say, it feels like an organic extension of where the series left off, but is also pushing things in a new, brighter, more fun direction. The version of Bond himself, which I'll admit is not necessarily the Bond I would ask for in my own fantasy version of a Bond story, is a young, unformed Bond. I personally don't have a huge interest in Bond origin stories, though I understand why this works for a video game especially well. And the version of Bond here is not the dark professional that I tend to prefer. He's not Timothy Dalton, who is my favorite Bond, and he's a little bit more affable, a little bit more gently charming. Based on what we saw in the trailer when Bond is initially revealed, I admired certain aspects of the character design. I love that we have finally seen the scar on the face that Ian Fleming gave his version of the character. But there's a sort of softness to Bond's look here, a sort of youthfulness that isn't necessarily what I aspire to in the character. I think the Bond character I enjoy when he's a little bit more rugged, when there's a little bit more mileage on him. But I understand why a video game in particular would want to start here, and I'm really excited to see how the game will continue to develop this character, because there are glimpses in the trailer of stuff that they don't lean into. For example, there's a brief moment where we do see that Bond is wearing a white dinner jacket against some fireworks. So there may be more what I might call classic Bond elements that they're just kind of holding back on. This was obviously just the initial trailer. Bond himself is a lot more of the cocky, aggressive sort. Very smug, very willing to buck authority. That sort of recklessness is a holdover from the Craig era, but it feels a lot more lighthearted here in the context of First Light than it ever did in the Craig era. It feels more like he is just a kind of maverick character. And maverick is actually an interesting word because some people have commented on the trailer that he has a sort of Ethan Hunt style presence. And I have to admit, this version of the character does feel like a little bit of a hybrid between James Bond and Ethan Hunt, in the same way that you could look at Daniel Craig in the early films of his run and say, oh, Craig's Bond is a synthesis of the classic Bond character and Jason Bourne and Jack Bauer, and you kind of got that mixed together. This version of Bond does feel a little bit more Ethan Hunt-esque, but there's a sort of cocky swagger that I've missed in the character for a while that I think will be fun to see again. It's something that I wanted the movies to return to. Furthermore, this is a character that is very much situated in a modern context. He has a revised backstory. He is part of the Naval Air Force. Forgive me if I don't have the exact terminology for what that is in the British military structure, but he's not directly part of the SAS as Daniel Craig's was, and he's not part of the same naval command that Fleming's Bond was. This has been updated for a new backstory. He's clearly embedded in a world of modern technology. There has been every emphasis to make this character feel very modern, right down to the fashion choices that he's wearing from Orlebar Brown. It's obviously pulling from that legacy of the more casual side of the Bond character, but that full tilt embrace of the casual edge also feels very contemporary. It seems like they've kind of softened the character a bit. He's a lot more casually and prototypically charming, I would say. His interactions with the supporting cast, particularly the prospective romance interests, it feels a lot warmer and softer than the sort of darker undercurrents that we got in the Craig era. It's much more in the vein of, I would say, really the Brosnan era and that sort of flirtatious feeling that we got from his Bond, this Bond that sort of exudes a kind of juvenile charm. Even as Brosnan's Bond started to mature, you still had that sort of juvenile impulse, and it feels sensible in a version of the character that is, again, very young. But I don't expect that to go away. I expect this version of the Bond character, to preserve that youthful ambiance. He's obviously a character who's committed to a lot of the tropes we expect. He wears an Omega watch, but again, the Omega watch that is featured in this trailer, which has not been released in the real world yet, so are we getting an actual Omega tie-in? Question mark. Is very modern. It's very sporty. Sporty is probably the right word to describe the First Light version of James Bond. He just feels very sporty. He feels very athletic. He feels very spry. And with that, there's a sort of youthful exuberance about him. I hope as the games go on, if this trilogy continues, we will see him get a little bit more weathered, a little bit more seasoned, a little tougher. But I'm curious to see what this lighter, more playful version of a Bond origin story can be. After all, we've already gotten the sort of dark, tragic version of it in Casino Royale, so a version of it that reframes Bond's origin in a more playful light is actually pretty welcome, especially if we're playing alongside the character and kind of getting to live alongside that character in this virtual experience. Beyond that, it's hard to comment too much about First Light because we just don't know that much about it. There are things I appreciate. They put Bond in a Nehru jacket in one sequence. That feels like a nice nod to the past. There's obviously some key references to Bond films past. I caught references to Thunderball and The Man with the Golden Gun. There's a lot of love for the Bond phenomenon in the way that this has been prepared, and I feel the care behind it. And that overrides some of my concerns that this unformed version of Bond actually just might feel more like a generically roguish action-adventure hero of the modern age. I think that is my one concern going into 007 First Light, that the character might just not feel Bond enough. But then again, we've only seen small snippets, and there are some promising hints at what I might consider really classic Bondian intrigue in this trailer, enough to get me excited, and enough for me to give this game the benefit of the doubt. I think it's exciting, and I honestly think in terms of positioning the character, positioning the feel of the series, this is not that far off from what I would want Bond 26 to be. My preferred version of Bond 26 would probably have some slight calibrations, but I did want Bond to veer back more into this exuberant fantasy, to have a little bit more of a spring in its step. And this is a Bond who has a spring in his step, and that is a really great thing to see. So I look forward to your comments. I look forward to what you thought of the trailer for 007 First Light, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one.